Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. Nixon's America. The year was 1972, and the United States was a nation divided. Across the country, the wounds of the Vietnam War remained raw, and a growing sense of disillusionment had taken hold among the American people. It was against this backdrop that Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, sought to solidify his power and cement his legacy. Nixon had risen to the highest office in the land through a combination of political savvy and a relentless ambition. A seasoned politician, he had weathered numerous scandals and setbacks, emerging stronger and more determined than ever. Now, with the country in the midst of a turbulent period, Nixon was determined to leave his mark on history. In the Oval Office, the president surrounded himself with a tight-knit circle of advisors, each of whom shared his unwavering commitment to maintaining power and protecting the Republican Party's interests. At the heart of this inner circle was H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff and one of the most influential figures in the administration. Haldeman, a former advertising executive, had a reputation for being ruthless and unyielding. He wielded immense influence over the president, kept shaping policy decisions and orchestrating the administration's response to political challenges. Together, Nixon and Haldeman formed a formidable partnership, driven by a shared belief in the importance of safeguarding the presidency at all costs. While the White House was a hive of activity, the Watergate office complex in downtown Washington, D.C., remained a relatively quiet and unassuming place. Nestled among the city's towering government buildings, the Watergate complex was home to a diverse array of tenants, from law firms to political organizations. One of these organizations was the Democratic National Committee, DNC, which had established its headquarters in the Watergate complex. Little did the DNC know that their offices would soon become the epicenter of a scandal that would forever alter the course of American politics. As the 1972 presidential election approached, the mood in the country was tense. The Vietnam War had dragged on for nearly a decade, and the public's trust in the government had reached a new low. Nixon, sensing an opportunity to solidify his power, launched a relentless campaign to secure a second term in office. The president's re-election strategy was twofold. On the one hand, he sought to appeal to the conservative base that had carried him to victory in 1968. On the other, he was determined to neutralize any potential threats from the Democratic opposition. It was this latter goal that would ultimately lead to the Watergate scandal, a saga that would come to define Nixon's presidency and forever change the course of American history. As the campaign season heated up, the president's inner circle grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that the Democrats were plotting to undermine their efforts. Haldeman, in particular, was obsessed with the idea of rooting out any potential threats to Nixon's re-election bid. It was against this backdrop that the Watergate break-in occurred on the night of June 17, 1972. 5 men, later identified as members of a covert intelligence unit known as the Plumbers, were caught red-handed attempting to plant wiretaps in the DNC's headquarters. The initial response from the White House was one of dismissal, with Press Secretary Ron Ziegler describing the incident as a third-rate burglary. However, as the investigation into the break-in gained momentum, it became clear that the affair was anything but a simple third-rate burglary. The FBI and the media began to uncover a complex web of political espionage, sabotage, and cover-ups that reached the highest levels of the Nixon administration. At the center of the scandal were Nixon and his inner circle, who were desperate to conceal their involvement in the Watergate break-in and the broader efforts to undermine the Democratic opposition. Haldeman, in particular, played a crucial role in the cover-up, using his influence and authority to obstruct the investigation and protect the president. As the Watergate scandal continued to unfold, the nation watched in horror as the veneer of Nixon's presidency began to crumble. The once powerful and seemingly untouchable leader was now facing a mounting tide of public scrutiny and political pressure, with his legacy and the very foundations of American democracy hanging in the balance. In the midst of this turmoil, 2 young journalists from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were quietly chipping away at the Watergate mystery, uncovering a trail of evidence that would ultimately expose the truth and bring down the Nixon administration. Their dogged pursuit of the story would go on to become the stuff of journalistic legend, a testament to the power of the free press and its role in holding those in power accountable. As the nation braced itself for the unfolding drama, the stage was set for a political showdown that would forever change the course of American history. The calm before the storm had passed, and a new era of political upheaval and reckoning was about to begin. Chapter 2: The Break-In and Cover-Up. On the evening of June 17, 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. The burglars, dressed in business suits and carrying an array of sophisticated electronic equipment, were quickly apprehended by the local police. Among them was James McCord, a security consultant with ties to the Nixon administration. As news of the break-in began to spread, the White House initially dismissed it as a third-rate burglary and a silly little thing. However, as the investigation intensified, it became clear that this was no ordinary criminal act. The burglars were found to be connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, and suspicions began to mount that the break-in was part of a larger conspiracy. In the days following the incident, Nixon's team, led by his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, sprang into action to contain the fallout. They sought to downplay the significance of the break-in and deflect attention away from the administration's involvement. Haldeman and others in the inner circle worked to obstruct the FBI's investigation, using their influence to interfere with the probe and conceal any connections to the White House. Despite the administration's efforts, the truth gradually began to emerge. Reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post doggedly pursued the story, uncovering a web of deception and abuse of power that reached the highest levels of government. Their investigation revealed that the Watergate break-in was just the tip of the iceberg, with the Nixon administration engaging in a broader campaign of political espionage and sabotage against its opponents. As the scandal unfolded, Nixon's initial dismissal of the incident as a third-rate burglary proved to be a grave miscalculation. The American public, already weary of the Vietnam War and growing distrustful of the government, became increasingly outraged by the revelations of corruption and cover-up. The Watergate scandal threatened to undermine the very foundations of the presidency and the democratic system. Despite the mounting evidence of his involvement, Nixon remained defiant, insisting that he had no prior knowledge of the break-in and that he was not personally responsible for the subsequent cover-up. However, as the investigations continued and more damning information came to light, his position became increasingly untenable. The turning point came in the 1972 presidential election, when Nixon won a landslide victory over his Democratic challenger, George McGovern. The lopsided outcome seemed to validate the administration's claims of innocence and bolster Nixon's political standing. But this sense of security was short-lived, as the Watergate scandal continued to unravel, casting a long shadow over the president's second term. As the investigations progressed, a series of revelations further eroded Nixon's credibility and support. Testimony from key figures such as former White House counsel John Dean and the discovery of the White House taping system, which recorded the president's conversations, provided damning evidence of the administration's efforts to obstruct justice. The scandal reached a critical juncture in early 1974, when the House of Representatives initiated impeachment proceedings against Nixon. The prospect of being the first president to be impeached and removed from office loomed large, and the pressure on Nixon mounted as his political support began to crumble. Throughout this tumultuous period, the American public remained riveted by the unfolding drama, as the media provided wall-to-wall coverage of the scandal's twists and turns. The Watergate affair had become a national obsession, with the public eagerly following the investigations and the growing calls for Nixon's resignation. As the noose tightened around the president, his administration's efforts to control the narrative and maintain a veneer of normalcy became increasingly futile. The release of the smoking gun tape, which would ultimately seal Nixon's fate, was still on the horizon, but the foundations of his presidency had already been shaken to their core. Chapter 3: Unraveling Threads. As the investigations into the Watergate break-in intensified, the threads of the scandal began to unravel, slowly exposing the depth of the Nixon administration's involvement and cover-up efforts. The public's interest in the case grew, and the pressure on the White House mounted as key figures came forward with damning revelations. In the weeks following the break-in, the FBI's investigation began to make significant progress. Agents uncovered evidence linking the burglars to the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, the organization overseeing Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. This discovery raised serious questions about the administration's knowledge and potential involvement in the illegal operation. John Dean, the White House counsel, had initially been tasked with leading the internal investigation into the scandal. However, as the FBI's probe continued, Dean grew increasingly concerned about his own potential legal exposure. In a pivotal moment, he decided to cooperate with prosecutors, providing a detailed account of the Nixon administration's efforts to obstruct justice and conceal its role in the Watergate break-in. Dean's testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee in June 1973 sent shockwaves through the nation. He described a systematic campaign of cover-up, implicating not only Haldeman and other senior aides, but also directly accusing the president of being aware of the plans to burglarize the DNC headquarters and subsequently attempt to cover it up. The president knew everything, Dean testified. He was fully aware of what was going on, and he participated in it. This damning revelation shattered the White House's previous claims of ignorance and innocence, further eroding public trust in the administration. The testimony of another key figure, Alexander Butterfield, proved to be another turning point in the scandal. Butterfield, a former Nixon aide, disclosed the existence of a secret White House taping system that had been recording conversations in the Oval Office since 1971. This bombshell revelation opened the door to the potential discovery of incriminating evidence that could directly implicate the president. The news of the taping system sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Suddenly, the possibility of obtaining a smoking gun that could conclusively prove Nixon's involvement in the cover-up became a very real prospect. The White House, now faced with the prospect of having to hand over the tapes, scrambled to devise a strategy to mitigate the damage. Nixon, realizing the gravity of the situation, initially resisted calls to release the tapes, claiming executive privilege and national security concerns. However, as the pressure mounted and the threat of impeachment loomed, the president eventually relented, agreeing to turn over the recordings to the special prosecutor's office. The release of the tapes in July 1974 marked a pivotal moment in the unraveling of the Watergate scandal. Transcripts of the recordings revealed damning evidence of Nixon's direct involvement in the cover-up, including his attempts to obstruct the FBI's investigation by having the CIA falsely claim national security concerns. One particular conversation, known as the smoking gun tape, captured Nixon instructing Haldeman to have the CIA intervene and block the FBI's probe. The president's own words, immortalized on tape, had become the smoking gun that would ultimately seal his fate. As the contents of the tapes became public, the political landscape shifted dramatically. Republicans who had previously stood by Nixon began to distance themselves, recognizing the inevitability of his downfall. The House of Representatives, which had been reluctant to pursue impeachment, now moved swiftly to initiate formal proceedings. The Washington Post, led by the dogged reporting of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, continued to break new stories, uncovering additional layers of the scandal. Their investigative work, combined with the revelations from the tapes, painted a damning picture of a president and his administration engaged in a systematic effort to cover up their wrongdoings. The public's reaction to the unfolding events was one of shock and disbelief. The idea that the highest office in the land had been tainted by such blatant corruption and abuse of power was a bitter pill to swallow. Calls for Nixon's resignation grew louder, as it became increasingly clear that he had lost the moral authority and political support necessary to continue leading the nation. In the face of the mounting evidence and the prospect of impeachment, Nixon's inner circle began to crumble. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and other key aides resigned, distancing themselves from the president and the scandal that threatened to consume them all. As the summer of 1974 drew to a close, the Watergate scandal had reached a critical juncture. The smoking gun tape had provided the irrefutable proof of Nixon's involvement in the cover-up, and the political pressure on the president had become overwhelming. The stage was set for the final act of this constitutional crisis, the resignation of Richard Nixon, the only U.S. president to ever step down from office. Chapter 4: The Smoking Gun. The air in the White House was thick with tension on August 5, 1974. President Richard Nixon had been summoned to the Oval Office to confront the damning evidence that would ultimately seal his political fate. Gathered around him were a handful of his closest advisors, their faces etched with a mix of trepidation and resignation. They all knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. Earlier that day, the House Judiciary Committee had released a transcript of a previously undisclosed conversation between Nixon and his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman. This recording, now infamously known as the smoking gun, laid bare the president's direct involvement in the Watergate cover-up, shattering his claims of innocence. The transcript revealed a chilling exchange from June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the Watergate break-in. In the recording, Nixon could be heard instructing Haldeman to have the Central Intelligence Agency falsely claim that the break-in was a matter of national security, effectively obstructing the FBI's investigation. This damning evidence directly contradicted Nixon's previous assertions that he had no prior knowledge of the Watergate burglary or the subsequent attempts to conceal his administration's involvement. As the president sat in the Oval Office, surrounded by his closest confidants, the weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. For months, he had stubbornly denied any wrongdoing, insisting that he was the victim of a witch hunt orchestrated by his political enemies. But now, the undeniable proof of his own words had shattered that narrative, exposing the truth that he had so desperately tried to bury. The release of the smoking gun tape marked a pivotal turning point in the Watergate scandal. In the days and weeks that followed, Nixon's political support rapidly crumbled, with even his most ardent allies abandoning him in the face of this irrefutable evidence of his involvement in the cover-up. Across the country, the American public watched in disbelief as the once powerful president was brought low by his own actions. The revelations sparked outrage and a deep sense of betrayal, as the nation grappled with the realization that the highest office in the land had been corrupted by an abuse of power. In the halls of Congress, the impact of the smoking gun tape was immediate and profound. The House Judiciary Committee, which had been conducting impeachment proceedings against Nixon, now had the smoking gun they had been searching for. The committee's members, both Democrats and Republicans, were united in their condemnation of the president's actions, and the momentum for impeachment swiftly gained steam. Meanwhile, the media's role in uncovering the truth came into sharp focus. The Washington Post, led by the intrepid investigative duo of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, had been at the forefront of the Watergate investigation from the beginning. Their tireless reporting, often in the face of fierce opposition from the Nixon administration, had helped to gradually peel away the layers of the cover-up and expose the depth of the scandal. Now, with the release of the smoking gun tape, Woodward and Bernstein's work was vindicated, and their reporting was hailed as a shining example of the vital role of a free and independent press in a democracy. Their dogged pursuit of the truth had played a crucial part in bringing down a president, a testament to the power of investigative journalism to hold those in power accountable. As the days passed, the pressure on Nixon mounted, with calls for his resignation echoing from all corners of the political landscape. Even members of his own party, once staunch defenders, now turned their backs on him, recognizing the irreparable damage to his credibility and the futility of any further attempts to cling to power. The final days of the Nixon presidency were shrouded in a somber, almost funereal atmosphere. The once confident leader who had once commanded the respect and loyalty of the nation now found himself isolated and abandoned, his legacy forever tainted by the Watergate scandal. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon delivered a televised address to the nation, announcing his resignation from from the office of the presidency. In a moment of rare humility, he acknowledged the gravity of his actions and the toll they had taken on the country, stating, "I have never been a quitter, but when you have to make the choice, I've made the choice. I hope I've made the right choice for the country." As Nixon's helicopter lifted off from the south lawn of the White House, carrying him and his family away from the seat of power they had once occupied, the nation watched with a mix of relief and sorrow. The Watergate scandal had not only toppled a president, but had also shaken the very foundations of American democracy, exposing the fragility of the system and the potential for abuse of power at the highest levels of government. Yet, in the aftermath of this constitutional crisis, there was also a sense of resilience and a renewed commitment to the principles of transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. The Watergate scandal had left an indelible mark on the American political landscape, serving as a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and the need to safeguard the democratic institutions that underpin the nation's cherished values. Chapter 5: The Fall of a President. The atmosphere in the White House had grown increasingly somber in the days following the release of the smoking gun tape on August 5, 1974. President Richard Nixon, once a formidable political force, now found himself clinging to the last vestiges of power as the weight of his involvement in the Watergate cover-up became undeniable. In the Oval Office, Nixon sat alone, his shoulders hunched, and his face etched with a mixture of resignation and anguish. The man who had once commanded the respect and loyalty of millions now faced the harsh reality that his presidency was coming to an end. The tapes, the damning evidence of his own words, had sealed his fate. As the days passed, Nixon's political support evaporated like a mist in the morning sun. Republican and Democratic leaders alike, once willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, now turned their backs on the embattled president. The once unthinkable had become inevitable. Richard Nixon would have to resign. On the morning of August 8, 1974, the White House staff gathered solemnly, bracing themselves for what was to come. The president's resignation speech had been scheduled for that evening, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of history unfolding. When Nixon finally appeared, the weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders. His eyes were sunken, and his typically confident demeanor had been replaced by a somber, almost defeated posture. As he approached the podium, the silence in the room was deafening, save for the occasional shuffle of papers and the soft click of camera shutters. "Good evening," Nixon began, his voice trembling slightly. "This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, and the last." The president paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body, but as president, I must put the interests of America first." The words hung in the air, a stark acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. Nixon's resignation, the first and only in the history of the American presidency, marked the end of an era and a profound shift in the nation's political landscape. In the days that followed, the nation watched in solemn reflection as Nixon departed the White House for the final time. As the presidential helicopter lifted off, carrying the disgraced leader away, a palpable sense of relief and uncertainty mingled in the air. The Watergate scandal had shaken the very foundations of American democracy, exposing the fragility of the system and the potential for abuse of power at the highest levels of government. The fallout from Nixon's resignation was immediate and far-reaching. Gerald Ford, Nixon's hand-picked successor, assumed the presidency and immediately faced the daunting task of restoring public trust in the office. One of his first acts was to pardon Nixon, a controversial decision that drew both praise and criticism from the American people. For many, the pardon symbolized the establishment's unwillingness to hold the former president fully accountable for his actions. The decision sparked outrage among those who felt that Nixon had evaded justice, while others saw it as a necessary step to heal the nation's wounds and move forward. In the years that followed, the Watergate scandal would continue to cast a long shadow over American politics. The reforms and safeguards implemented in its wake, such as the Ethics in Government Act, served as a testament to the enduring strength of the American democratic system. Yet the scars of the crisis remained, a stark reminder that even the most powerful institutions are not immune to the corrupting influence of power. As the nation grappled with the aftermath of Watergate, the legacy of Richard Nixon became a subject of intense debate and scrutiny. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a man whose ambition and desire for power had ultimately led to his downfall. Others viewed him as a ruthless and unrepentant criminal whose actions had betrayed the public trust and undermined the very foundations of American democracy. Regardless of one's perspective, the Watergate scandal had forever altered the landscape of American politics. The role of the media, the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches, and the public's perception of their leaders had all been irrevocably changed. The nation had been forced to confront the sobering reality that even the highest office in the land was not immune to the temptations of corruption and abuse of power. As the final curtain fell on the Nixon presidency, the American people were left to grapple with the profound lessons of Watergate. The scandal had shaken the very core of the nation's democratic ideals, and its impact would be felt for generations to come. The fall of a president had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the fragility of power and the importance of holding those in authority accountable.